Cheating wife walks out. Husband shocks her with ultimate revenge. True story. I never thought my life would take such a sharp turn. One moment, I was a man who had everything. A stable marriage, a home filled with memories, and a future I thought was secure. The next, I found myself standing in the middle of my living room, gripping my phone, listening to a voice that would shatter my world. "You don't know me," the man said, his tone careful but firm. "But I work with your wife. You need to hear this." I could have hung up. I could have ignored the warning, brushed it off as a mistake. But something in his voice stopped me. A mix of regret and obligation. He wasn't calling to stir up drama. He was calling because he believed I deserved to know. "Go on," I said. My voice steady despite the sudden weight pressing on my chest. The details came out one by one, each one cutting deeper than the last. Lunches together every day. Whispered conversations in the office. Plans for a night at a hotel. The words twisted in my head, refusing to settle. "She thinks you'll let her do this," the man continued. "That you love her enough to look the other way." That was the moment something inside me broke. The thought that the person I had trusted more than anyone believed I would just accept this. That I would stay silent. That I would be too weak to stop her. I thanked the man and ended the call. My hands were still gripping the phone, but my mind was already racing ahead. I had two choices. Confront her now or wait for proof. I had always been a man who believed in logic, in certainty. Accusations without evidence meant nothing. But if she was really planning this, if she was truly willing to betray me and come home like nothing happened, I needed to know for sure. I made my decision. The next morning, I contacted a private investigator. Felt surreal, like something out of a movie. But this was real. This was my life. The investigator didn't ask unnecessary questions. He had seen this before too many times. He laid out the plan, surveillance, photos, timestamps. Cold, hard truth. Days passed in slow motion. She acted the same. Smiling, laughing, texting on her phone with a casual ease that made my blood boil. I studied her, searching for signs I had somehow missed before. But there was nothing. If she was guilty, she didn't feel the need to hide it. Then the night arrived. She walked downstairs, dressed in an outfit I hadn't seen before, a small bag in her hand. "Going somewhere?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She smiled, like it was any other evening. "Just out for a bit. Dinner. Maybe some dancing." I nodded, keeping my breathing steady. "With who?" She tilted her head slightly, as if considering whether to lie. But then, she simply shrugged. "Someone from work. Like a date." She laughed. A light, careless sound. "It's not like that. I just think it would be nice to experience something new." I stared at her, letting the silence stretch. She had no shame, no hesitation. "Are you asking for permission?" I finally said. "Permission?" She seemed amused by the question. "No, I just thought you'd understand. It's just one night." I clenched my jaw. "And what happens after?" "Nothing," she said, as if it were obvious. "I come home, and everything goes back to normal. This doesn't change us." Took everything in me to stay calm. "So, if I did the same thing, you'd be fine with it?" She hesitated for the first time. "That's different." "How?" She sighed, shifting her bag in her hand. "Because I know you. You're not the type to do that." There it was. The arrogance. The certainty that I would always be the one who stayed, who forgave, who accepted whatever she decided. I stepped aside. "Then go." She blinked, as if she hadn't expected me to say it so easily. "You're not mad." "I didn't say that." "Then why aren't you stopping me?" I met her eyes. "Because when you walk out that door, you're not coming back." She laughed again, softer this time, as if I had just made a silly joke. Then she kissed me on the cheek, whispered, "See you tomorrow," and walked away. I didn't watch her get into the car. I didn't watch her drive off. I didn't need to, because while she was gone, I was about to make sure she had nothing left to come home to. I stood in the middle of our house, the silence pressing down on me like a weight I had never felt before. It wasn't the quiet itself that was unsettling. It was the knowledge of what it meant. She was gone. Not permanently, not yet, but the decision had already been made. She just didn't know it. I moved quickly, my hands steady despite the storm raging inside me. I grabbed trash bags and started packing. Clothes, shoes, everything that belonged to her went into the bags. Her beauty products, her jewelry, the framed pictures she had carefully arranged around the house. All of it. I didn't pause to second-guess myself. I didn't stop to feel anything. The moment she walked out that door, she gave up the right to call this place home. Took me nearly 2 hours to clear out her presence. By the time I was done, the house felt different. Lighter. Like a weight I hadn't even realized I had been carrying had finally been lifted. I rolled her car out of the garage and parked it on the street, placing the bags inside and locking the doors. The keys? I left them on the driver's seat. Then I sat down in the living room, staring at the empty space where our life together had once felt real. I wasn't sad. I wasn't even angry. I was just done. At some point, exhaustion hit me, but sleep refused to come. The hours dragged by as I replayed the night over and over in my head. The way she had smiled, so sure of herself. The way she had kissed me on the cheek, already dismissing my warning as empty words. The way she truly believed she could step out for a night with another man and return to a husband who would welcome her back without hesitation. By the time the sun rose, I had already showered, dressed, and was out the door before my phone even had the chance to ring. But when it did, I wasn't surprised. "Hey, man," the investigator's voice came through. "You were right. She didn't even try to hide it. I didn't need to hear the details. Not yet. Send me everything," I said. A few hours later, I sat in my car outside the lawyer's office, flipping through the photos. Her smiling at him, their hands brushing over dinner, his arm around her waist as they walked into the hotel, her leaning in for a kiss as the elevator doors shut. Proof. Unshakable, undeniable proof. I stepped into the office and handed the file to the woman behind the desk. She glanced at the contents and nodded. "Do you want to wait and hear your options? Or should I just start the paperwork?" "Start the paperwork," I said without hesitation. She paused, studying me for a moment. "You don't want to talk to her first?" I shook my head. She already made her choice. Now I'm making mine. The process was set in motion. There would be no arguments. No pleas, no drawn-out fights over property or assets. The house wasn't even in her name, something she had never seemed concerned about before. But she would be now. By the time I pulled into the driveway that evening, I felt nothing but clarity. The life I had built with her was already a memory, and memories couldn't be undone. It wasn't until nearly noon the next day that she showed up. She rang the doorbell twice before knocking. When I opened the door, she was standing there, her brows furrowed in confusion. "Hey, my key doesn't work." I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Yeah, I changed the locks." Her eyes darted past me, looking into the house like she expected to see everything exactly the way she had left it. But then her gaze landed on her car, parked on the street, and the bags stuffed inside. "What is this?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. I stayed quiet, letting the realization sink in. "You're serious," she finally said, her voice edged with disbelief. "You're actually kicking me out?" I exhaled slowly, watching her closely. "I told you last night, if you walked out that door, you weren't coming back." Her lips parted, like she was about to argue, but no words came out. She glanced at the car again, her breathing uneven. "You're overreacting," she finally said, a small laugh escaping her. "It was just one night. Nothing even happened." I tilted my head. "Then why'd you book a hotel room?" The color drained from her face. Why'd you let him touch you like that?" I continued, my voice calm but firm. "Why'd you kiss him?" Her hands curled into fists at her sides. "Who told you that?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. "You had me followed?" she demanded, her voice turning sharp. "You invaded my privacy?" I let out a short laugh, shaking my head. "Your privacy? You're the one who threw our marriage away like it meant nothing. You think you can cry about privacy now?" She took a step forward, lowering her voice. We can fix this. I made a mistake. Okay? It was stupid, I get that. But you're taking it too far. I held her gaze. No, I'm not. Please, she whispered, reaching out as if she was going to touch my arm. We can talk about this. Let me in and we'll talk. I didn't move. You need to leave, I said, each word deliberate. Everything you own is in your car. I suggest you take it and go. Her breath hitched, her eyes searching mine for something she wasn't going to find. You're actually doing this, she murmured. You're actually throwing me out. I didn't throw you out, I corrected. You did that yourself. She opened her mouth again, but I was done. I stepped back and shut the door in her face. I stood behind the closed door, listening. For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then came the sound of her footsteps shifting, the rustling of fabric, a deep inhale. She was still out there, processing. I could almost see the wheels turning in her head, scrambling for a way out, a way back in. Then the pounding began. Not polite knocking, angry, desperate thuds against the wood. You can't do this, she yelled. This is my home too. I exhaled slowly, running a hand down my face. I knew this was coming. The denial, the attempt to reclaim what she had so casually thrown away. She had convinced herself I was bluffing, that I'd get angry, maybe yell, but in the end, I'd give in. That's how she saw me. Predictable, steady, always forgiving. But that version of me was gone. You can't just lock me out, she screamed, slamming her fists against the door again. Let me in. We need to talk. I leaned against the wall, arms crossed, waiting. She had to realize eventually. A few minutes passed, then silence again. When I finally looked out the window, I saw her standing by her car, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the bags inside like they were foreign objects. She reached for the door handle but hesitated, like getting inside would mean accepting reality. Then she turned back to the house. I'll call the police, she shouted. You can't just throw me out. I opened the door just enough to meet her eyes. Go ahead. Call them. This house isn't in your name, and everything you own is in that car. See how that works out for you. Her lips parted, but no words came. She knew I was right. Instead, her expression twisted into something else. Anger, betrayal, disbelief all tangled together. So that's it, she spat. You're just done? Over one stupid mistake. I narrowed my eyes. It wasn't a mistake. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is saying something you didn't mean in an argument. What you did was a choice. You planned it. You followed through with it. And you expected me to accept it. She let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head. You're acting like I slept with him. You might as well have. I shot back. Her face flinched, like the words had actually hit her. Good. Let them sink in. I never would have done it, she muttered, crossing her arms. It was just an idea, something different. I was curious, but I never would have actually gone through with it. I stared at her, letting the silence stretch. You really expect me to believe that? I don't know, she snapped, then sighed, dragging a hand through her hair. I thought it wouldn't be a big deal. I thought we were stronger than this. I let out a short, bitter laugh. Stronger? You thought our marriage was strong enough to survive you going on a date, booking a hotel room, and sneaking around behind my back? That's not strength, that's stupidity. Her eyes darkened, her jaw tightening. You don't have to be such a jerk about it. You don't have to be a cheater, I countered. That shut her up. She let out a shaky breath and looked away, biting her lip. So what happens now? You leave, I said simply, and we get divorced. She flinched again, wrapping her arms tighter around herself. Just like that. Just like that, I confirmed. She stared at me, searching my face for something. Remorse, hesitation, doubt. Anything she could use to pull me back in. But I gave her nothing. Her shoulders sagged. I don't have anywhere to go. Not my problem. Figure it out, I said, stepping back inside. You figured out how to betray me. I'm sure you can figure out where to sleep tonight. Before she could respond, I closed the door again. She stayed outside for another 10 minutes. I knew because I stood by the window watching. She paced, ran her hands through her hair, pulled out her phone, then put it away. She wasn't calling anyone. She had too much pride for that. But eventually, she got into the car. She sat there for a while, staring at the wheel. Then, without another glance back, she started the engine and drove away. And just like that, it was done. I exhaled, finally letting my body relax. The house was empty, silent. I should have felt relief. I should have felt victory. But all I felt was exhaustion. The phone rang, snapping me out of it. I glanced at the screen. A number I didn't recognize. I answered. Logan Carter? Who's asking? A pause. Then a familiar voice. Andrew Wallace. The guy who had called me about my wife in the first place. I straightened. What do you want? You might want to sit down for this, he said. I thought you should know Ethan quit today. Packed up his desk. Left without a word. Nobody knows where he went. I frowned, gripping the phone tighter. Why are you telling me this? Because I overheard something before he left. Andrew continued. He was on the phone. Said something about heading south. Something about your wife. The words slammed into me like a brick. I stood there, gripping the phone, heartbeat steady but mind racing. Thought you'd want to know, Andrew said. I took a slow breath, forcing my voice to stay calm. Thanks. No problem, he said. And for what it's worth, you did the right thing. The line went dead. I lowered the phone, staring at nothing. Ethan was gone. My wife was gone. But somehow, I had a feeling this wasn't over yet. I sat in the quiet of the house, phone still in my hand, Andrew Wallace's words echoing in my head. Ethan quit today. Packed up his desk. Left without a word. Something about heading south. Something about your wife. I should have felt relief knowing she was gone, knowing the door had closed on that chapter of my life. But instead, there was something else. A slow, simmering unease crawling under my skin. Ethan leaving town? Why now? And why mention her? Had she gone straight to him? Was she that desperate to find someone to take her in after realizing she had nowhere else to go? Or was there something more to it? I shook the thoughts away and leaned back against the couch, rubbing a hand over my face. This wasn't my problem anymore. She wasn't my problem anymore. Whatever mess she got herself into now, I wasn't going to be the one to clean it up. I forced myself to focus on what came next. The divorce was in motion. I had already met with my lawyer, had the paperwork ready to go. The next step was getting it into her hands, making sure she signed it so I could be done with this for good. But something told me it wouldn't be that easy. The next morning, I went to work like it was any other day. I threw myself into my job, focusing on sales, meeting clients, doing everything I could to keep my mind from wandering. It worked for a while. But the moment I had a break, I found myself checking my phone, half expecting some kind of message. Something from her. Something from Andrew. Some confirmation that whatever was happening on her end was no longer tied to me. But there was nothing. At lunch, my boss called me into his office. Logan, he said, leaning back in his chair. How are you holding up? I frowned. I'm fine. Why? He studied me for a moment, then sighed. Your ex came by the dealership this morning. I stiffened. She what? She was looking for you, he said. Said she needed to talk. I told her you weren't here. I exhaled slowly, gripping the arms of the chair. Did she say what it was about? He shook his head. Just that it was important. But she didn't look good, Logan. She looked like hell. I clenched my jaw. I don't care how she looks. Yeah, my boss said, nodding. Didn't think you would. Just thought you should know. I left his office, trying to push down the frustration creeping up my spine. Why the hell was she coming to my job? She had no reason to see me. She had my number. If she had something to say, she could have called. But no. She wanted to show up in person, force me into a conversation I had no interest in having. She was trying to get back in. I wasn't going to let her. That night, I got home and double-checked the locks. Not because I thought she'd do something crazy, but because I wanted to be sure she understood that she had no place here anymore. I went about my evening like normal, but something felt off. A strange heaviness settled in the air, like something was coming. I didn't know what, but I could feel it. I was right. At exactly 9:47 p.m., my phone rang. The caller ID flashed a familiar name. Brenda. I debated ignoring it, but something told me to pick up. What? I answered, not bothering with pleasantries. Logan, she said, her voice tight. You need to come to the hospital. Everything inside me went still. I sat up straighter. Why? It's her, Brenda said, barely above a whisper. She got hurt. I closed my eyes for a moment, inhaling slowly. What happened? Ethan, she said. He beat the hell out of her. I gripped the phone tighter. And why exactly do you think I care? Brenda sighed. I don't know, Logan. Maybe you don't. But she's in bad shape. And like it or not, you're still technically her husband. I clenched my jaw. Not for long. Fine, Brenda snapped. But can you at least show up? Even if it's just to make sure she signs the damn papers. That got my attention. I was silent for a moment, then exhaled through my nose. Which hospital? I walked through the hospital doors 15 minutes later. The place smelled like antiseptic and bad coffee, and I hated it immediately. Brenda was already in the waiting area, arms crossed, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. When she saw me, she straightened. She's in room 204. I didn't ask if she was okay. I didn't ask what condition she was in. I just walked past Brenda and down the hall. When I stepped inside the room, the first thing I saw was her face. Bruised, swollen, a cut above her eyebrow, another along her cheekbone. Her wrist was wrapped in a brace, and an M4 was taped to her arm. She looked up when she heard me, her eyes widening slightly. Logan. I stood in the doorway, hands in my pockets. You look like hell. She let out a breathy, painful laugh. Yeah, I feel like it too. I didn't move closer. I didn't sit. I just watched her. She shifted slightly, wincing as she did. Are you really not going to say anything? I raised a brow. Like what? She swallowed, glancing away. Like, I don't know. Maybe something besides an insult. I stayed silent for a long moment. You did this to yourself. Her eyes snapped back to mine. You really think I deserved this? I think you made your choices, I said. And now you're dealing with the consequences. She inhaled sharply, blinking a few times. I didn't ask for this, Logan. You didn't have to, I said. You walked right into it. A heavy silence settled between us. She shifted again, staring down at her hands. I don't have anywhere to go. Not my problem, I said flatly. She looked up, something desperate flickering in her eyes. Logan, please. I don't. I pulled the divorce papers from my jacket pocket and dropped them onto the tray beside her bed. Sign these. She stared at them, then back at me. You brought them here? She whispered. You're not coming back to my house, I said. This ends now. She swallowed hard. And if I don't sign? I leaned in just enough for her to see how serious I was. Then I'll make sure you regret it. For the first time, she looked genuinely afraid. Not of me, but of the reality settling in. The realization that I was done. That there were no second chances. Her hand trembled as she reached for the pen. I watched as she signed her name. And just like that, it was finally over. I took the signed divorce papers without a word, folded them neatly, and slipped them back into my jacket. I had waited for this moment, anticipated it, even planned it down to the last detail. But standing there in that cold, sterile hospital room, watching her struggle to sit up, her face a swollen mess, I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, no pity, just emptiness. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but I was already turning toward the door. Logan, wait, she rasped, her voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. I stopped but didn't turn around. For what? For, I don't know. Just don't go yet. I sighed, tilting my head slightly but still refusing to face her. Why? What do you think there is left to say? She hesitated, and I could hear the exhaustion in her breath. I messed up, she admitted, and for the first time, there was no arrogance in her voice, no entitlement, no excuses. I know that now. I exhaled sharply through my nose. Took you long enough. I thought. She swallowed hard, her voice thick with something that almost sounded like regret. I thought you would always be there, no matter what. I thought you'd get angry, but we'd figure it out. I turned then, slowly, keeping my expression blank. You didn't just mess up. You broke something that can't be fixed. And the worst part? You never thought about how it would feel for me. You only cared about what you thought you could get away with. She flinched but didn't argue. That was new. I shook my head. Whatever you want from me, I don't have it to give. You made your bed. Tears welled in her swollen eyes, but I had already stopped caring. She had only ever cried when she was caught. Never before. Never when it mattered. I didn't say anything else. I just turned and walked out. Brenda was still in the waiting area, arms crossed, her expression tight. When she saw me, she pushed off the wall, but I spoke before she could. She signed. Brenda nodded, exhaling. Good. I moved past her toward the elevator, but she grabbed my arm. Logan. I stopped but didn't look at her. What? She's got nowhere to go. I let out a humorless laugh. Again, not my problem. She's still my sister. Then take her, I said, pulling my arm away. She's not my wife anymore. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside, pressing the button for the ground floor. Brenda watched me, her face unreadable, and for a second, I thought she might try to say something else. But the doors slid shut between us. By the time I walked into my house, the weight that had been pressing on me for months was gone. I had been carrying her betrayal, her arrogance, her assumptions that I would always be there to pick up the pieces. Now they weren't mine to carry anymore. I opened a bottle of whiskey, poured a glass, and sat in the quiet of my home. My home. Not ours. Not hers. Just mine. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. The next few weeks were quiet. My phone barely rang, except for work calls and the occasional update from my lawyer. I threw myself into my job, selling RVs like I was running from something, though I wasn't sure what. Maybe I just needed the distraction. The dealership was steady, predictable. Customers came in looking for adventure, couples planning their retirements, families preparing for road trips. It was a business built on movement, on escape. And for the first time, I wondered if that was what I needed too. Then, one afternoon, as I was finishing up a sale, my boss called me into his office. You've been working hard, he said, tapping a pen against his desk. I think you need some time off. I frowned. I don't need time off. He smirked. It wasn't a suggestion. I let out a slow breath, rubbing the back of my neck. How long? A couple weeks. He leaned back in his chair. Actually, I've got something that might help clear your head. Remember the Parker couple? The ones who bought that motorhome? I nodded. Yeah. What about them? They need someone to drive it back to Texas for them. They were traveling when James had a minor heart attack. He's fine now, but they had to fly back, and their RV is still sitting in a storage lot up north. I hesitated. You want me to drive it down? Think of it as a paid vacation, he said with a shrug. Take your time. See some sights. Clear your head. I considered it. The idea of getting away, of just driving, of not being stuck in the same damn routine, sounded better than I wanted to admit. I exhaled and nodded. All right, I'll do it. A few days later, I was on a plane heading north. When I landed, I took a cab to the lot where the motorhome was parked, handed over the necessary paperwork, and climbed into the driver's seat. It was strange, being alone in such a big space. Just me, the open road, and nowhere specific to be. As I pulled onto the highway, a strange sense of relief settled over me. No texts from her. No fights. No waiting for the other shoe to drop. Just me and the road ahead. But life had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected them. Because a few hundred miles later, I made a stop at a small roadside diner. I walked in, ordered a coffee, and sat at the counter. And that's when I saw her. She was sitting a few stools down, flipping through a menu, tapping a spoon against the counter absent-mindedly. She had dark hair, tied back in a loose ponytail, and wore a leather jacket over a plain t-shirt. There was something sharp in her expression, something guarded. She caught me looking, raised an eyebrow. "You gonna stare all day? Or are you gonna buy me a coffee?" I smirked despite myself. "Depends. You always this friendly to strangers?" She shrugged. "Only the ones who look like they could use a drink." I let out a short laugh. "It's been a long year." She gave me a knowing look. "Yeah, I know that feeling." And just like that, my story took an unexpected turn. I didn't know it then, but that moment in the diner would be the start of something I never saw coming. She wasn't like anyone I had met before. There was something about the way she carried herself, like she had seen enough of life to know better than to waste time on small talk, but still had a sharp wit that cut through the silence. I had planned on finishing my coffee, paying my bill, and getting back on the road. Instead, I found myself staying longer than I meant to, drawn into a conversation that felt easy in a way I hadn't felt in years. Her name was Vanessa. She had been on the road for a while, heading nowhere in particular, just moving for the sake of movement. There was something familiar in that. We talked about everything and nothing, where she had been, where I was headed, the best and worst roadside diners in the country. I told her I was just delivering an RV, but somehow, she saw through that. "You're not just on a job," she said, stirring her coffee. "You're running from something." I smirked. "Maybe. What about you?" She smirked back. "Oh, I'm running too. I just don't know where I'm going yet." There was something refreshing about her honesty. No games, no pretending. Just a stranger in a roadside diner who seemed to understand exactly what I was feeling without me having to say it out loud. I should have gotten up and left, but I didn't. Instead, we ended up splitting a meal, then another cup of coffee, then talking until the place started to close. It had been a long time since I had felt comfortable just existing in someone else's presence without worrying about what came next. But eventually, the reality of the road called, and I knew I had to leave. "I should get going," I said, throwing a few bills on the counter. She nodded, glancing at the door. "Yeah, me too." But neither of us moved. For a moment, I considered it, asking if she wanted to come with me, or if I should follow wherever she was going. But that wasn't me. That wasn't what I needed. Not yet. "Take care, Logan," she said finally, standing and grabbing her jacket. "You too, Vanessa," I replied. And just like that, she was gone. I got back on the road that night, driving longer than I should have, my mind replaying our conversation over and over. It was strange how someone I had met for only a few hours could leave such an impression. But maybe that was just how things worked when you were starting over, when the past was finally behind you and the future was still unwritten. By the time I reached Texas, I felt lighter. I parked the RV at the designated drop-off and handed over the keys. James and Dodie Parker were waiting for me, as grateful as ever. "You look better," Dodie said as she handed me a cup of coffee. I raised an eyebrow. "Better than what?" "Than the last time we saw you," she said with a knowing smile. "Like you finally let something go." I didn't answer, just sipped my coffee and nodded. Maybe she was right. The next few months passed quietly. The divorce was finalized without much of a fight. She signed the papers in the hospital, and after that, she was gone. No pleading, no last-ditch efforts to win me back. It was over. Clean. Brenda reached out a few times, but I never answered. She had made her choice too, and I didn't have room in my life for people who had stood by and let betrayal happen. My mother called occasionally, carefully avoiding the topic of my ex, but I knew she was relieved. She had seen what my father's cheating had done to her, and she had spent years hoping I wouldn't suffer the same fate. In a way, maybe she blamed herself for pushing me to forgive, but I didn't hold it against her. I focused on work, on rebuilding. My boss offered me more road assignments, and I took every one of them. I liked being on the move, liked the feeling of distance between me and the life I had left behind. Then, one evening, after a long drive back from a dealership convention, I walked into my favorite diner, the same one where I had met Vanessa months ago, and there she was, sitting at the counter, stirring a cup of coffee, looking just as restless as before. She saw me before I could even say anything. "Took you long enough?" she said with a smirk. I chuckled, shaking my head as I slid onto the stool beside her. "Been busy?" "Yeah." She raised an eyebrow. "Running or just driving?" I considered that for a moment. "Little of both." She nodded as if that made perfect sense. I glanced at her empty plate. "You eat yet?" "Not yet," she admitted. I signaled the waitress. "Then let's fix that." She smiled. "On one condition." I leaned back. "And what's that?" "You tell me what you're running from." I took a deep breath, letting the weight of the past roll off my shoulders. "Not running anymore," I said. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Good." And just like that, my story truly began again. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload.